Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Well, Dave, it's a big holiday weekend. We are both traveling on the road. I have my friend Bear sitting with me back here. This is my daughter's dog, and I think he's bigger than I am.
he had to sit up as soon as he heard his name.
Yeah, I shouldn't have mentioned his name. He'll probably head out in a little bit. But he said he might chime in if he has something to add to our podcast. Where are you right now?
I've been trying to use Independence Day more than 4th of July. There's just something right about calling this Independence Day and not calling it 4th of July. And so I've been going with the Independence Day. Anyway, because of the holiday, the rates on some of the Airbnbs that I've been staying in have been going up. So I transitioned a little further out of Nashville just for the week. I'm up in a little town called Hendersonville, Tennessee. It's about 35 minutes north of downtown Nashville, and spending some time there, and actually heading out as soon as we finish this podcast. And I'll tell you what, Nashville on 4th of July is like Times Square on New Year's Eve. They brought out bands last night. They closed off all of Broadway. They said they thought there were about 250,000 people packed down Broadway, and the fireworks show last night lasted 42 minutes.
Wow,
I've never seen anything like it.
Right.
So it was a really cool time, and even better, we had a few guardians from the Vino Veritas Society who were here visiting me, keeping me company, and I took them to see the venue. And
tell me some good news here. We're celebrating. July 4th is the day the Declaration of Independence was approved. That famous document, that famous line, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Have Americans come to embrace that idea? Can we say that today in 2022 that Americans believe in the idea of universal natural equality and equal natural rights?
Man, Tom, we still have a lot of teaching to do, unfortunately. And we're gonna have to ramp up. We're going to have to amp up a little bit, turn the volume up a little bit on what we're doing, because there's still a lot of people who need to learn. And now that said, I felt more of a sense of community last night around the holiday and around the fireworks than I have in a very long time. And I don't know if that's the current state of the country and sort of the pains that we're all feeling mutually, right? We're all feeling these same pains at the gas pump and in the grocery stores and everything else. And I don't know if there's a sense of camaraderie coming from that. I don't know if it's just I'm in a different place. It's been a long time since I haven't celebrated Independence Day at Coors Field with the Rockies.
Right.
It's one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite fireworks shows out there. And so this time was one of the first I didn't celebrate in Colorado in a long time. Obviously, I had my time out of state, but it was a really nice night. Now, that said, I wanted to bring attention to a movie that I saw before we get into any further conversation about the Declaration. I wanted to bring a movie that I watched with a friend about a week and a half ago. And I'm going to ruin it because I don't encourage anybody to watch this movie. It was complete leftist propaganda. As much as we are happy that Netflix is starting to show more things and standing up on behalf of guys like Dave Chappelle, this was not that movie. It was called Shadows of the Moon. And in the end, it turns out that it's this time travel movie. So you know this, and I think some of our members know this. I think I've talked about this a little bit. I love dystopian movies,
right?
The old dystopian tales. And I'm not the sci-fi guy who really is into like all the sci-fi science fiction of the dystopian movies. I love watching them to break down and see how that writer and director portray a society going through different forms of government, right? Whether it's the Hunger Games and how you have those in the Capitol who are really pushing back. And really what we see more often than not is in this dystopian movies, the heroes are the freedom fighters. The heroes are the people who believe what we believe. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add here real quick, Dave. One of the great challenges of science fiction is when it's done really well, the science part of the science fiction is done really well. And so a lot of people gravitate toward the science part, like they're fascinated by, all this, the science in the science fiction. And yet really the purpose of those dystopian movies or fictional stories you're talking about, it's always to convey an important moral message, an important political message. There's usually a commentary or an insight into human nature deep inside those science fiction stories, and that often gets lost because of the interest in the science.
Right. And in this movie, they did do one nice thing that I was really impressed with. They showed the dangers of mob mentality, right? So we saw the how do you even describe her? The woman who started as the villain in the movie and turns into the heroine at the end is a young black woman. She's believed to be killed by a white cop in 1988 in Chicago. Okay. And so you start seeing these mass protests going on in the street, and these people saying white cops are killing black children and this and that. And I mean, it felt very Black Lives Matter to me. And at the same time, you're watching this and the backstory as the viewer of the movie, knowing that this woman was going around murdering people and was trying to murder the cop that actually ended up killing her. So the movie starts off really strong, where they're really portraying this mob of people going after this white cop, thinking he did this because he's a racist and he did this because of all of these things. Now, they completely ignore the fact that his partner was black, who was also one of his mentors, and they really ignore the rest of the story. And the police are not allowing people to know what actually happened. So I'm thinking, okay, we're off to a good start. This is reasonable. This shows the mob mentality. It shows all of these great things. Yeah. The movie ends up being about this woman who time travels, and she keeps going further and further back in time because she is finding the root of white nationalism in America. And at the end, it fast forwards to 2024, which, like, for a movie made in the last year, it's not necessarily going very far in the future. And it's saying there was a rise of white nationalism that caused a civil war. And she went back and she found the first domino, the first person who caused a couple more people to think about it, and a couple more people to think about it, and a couple more people to think about it, that grew exponentially into this body of people that was a civil war. And I'm watching with my friend, and I said, this was the biggest piece of propaganda I've ever seen. And I said that because I said, look, there very well might be a revolution in this country at some point in the not too distant future. We don't know, but there's a lot of anger right now. We've talked about similarities to the 1850s. We've talked about how what's happening in the Supreme Court right now has a lot of the feel of Dred Scott to it. And it's really interesting in all of those ways. But I said to him, if there's a revolution, it's not going to be over white nationalism. I said, at the end of the day, white nationalists are just this little small tiny fraction of the overall population, and they might be vocal and that might be loud, and there's some bad people. And if David Duke was sitting in a room with me right now, he would try to do everything he could so I didn't walk out, right? So we do know that there are those people. But I said there's not enough to actually create this revolution, this civil war. Civil war is not going to be fought over white nationalism. It's going to be fought over people finally saying, you've taken enough of my property, you've taken enough of my rights, and I want to live freely again. It led us to this very long conversation. I introduced my friend to Thomas Sowell. We started looking at Thomas Sowell quotes and Thomas Sowell books, and he got very interested, and we had this really great, phenomenal conversation. And then all of a sudden, this week on Facebook,
hang on,
friend
Dave.
of mine who,
Hey, Dave, before you move on, I don't know how much of the movie you want to give away. I've not seen the movie, but you said that this time traveling woman finds the first white nationalist Was he in 2016? Was he a presidential candidate, or does she go back farther than that?
She did go back a lot further than that. She actually went back and found him right at the time the progressive movement was getting started. Now, the movie would tell you it's a totally different, they're totally separate.
Right.
It turns out, I'm going to just completely ruin the movie. And it got really stupid at this point. It turns out the cop who killed her in 1988 was actually her grandfather. And she wasn't born until 2022, this year. And she had been going back and back and back. And she keeps telling him, don't kill me. At one point, you're the one who taught me to do this. You're the one who told me to take this job. You're the one who told me. And he catches her on the beach in 2012 or 2016. And she says, I have to do this. And he says, oh, okay. And he just lets her go. And she starts going further back in time and eventually late 1800s, early 1900s, finds the culprit, goes in and kills him. So
gotcha.
And they make her out to be a hero.
This actually ties together, because I'm thinking as I listen to you talk, if there is any threat of white nationalism, I mean, white nationalism is a version. It's one branch of tribal identity politics, right? People who identify with their group, their tribe, their culture, whether it's based on race or ethnicity or religion or anything else. Right? They say, this is my group and we're better than everyone else who's not in my group. And where do we hear that kind of, where's that coming from? That kind of group, tribal, identity politics. That's what progressivism pushes continuously.
Right. I had felt really good. I had this great conversation after the movie, and I felt like I got a friend to become a little more aware of this agenda of white nationalism that we're seeing in the media and that we're seeing in movies that really, I think, is this little fringe minority. And then I see somebody who I'm a Facebook friend with. I've never met the guy in my life. I'm not going to share his name, but I've never actually met the guy in my life. Post on Facebook, how about we make July White Pride Month? And you pointed out in the past, and you're probably right. I think he was saying it a bit sarcastically, and it was how about if we have LGBTQ month, and we've got this month, and last month was Pan Asian American month, and all of these things. We should have
Black History Month, right?
Right.
Yeah, all these groups, right? That these celebrations about particular groups and cultures.
And I don't know if he said it in jest. I think he did. I do know for a fact he was heavily fighting for. He's in Colorado, and he was heavily fighting for Greg Lopez as governor. So he can't be that racist if he's advocating for a Hispanic man over a white woman in the primary for governor. However, then I start looking into the comments, and there are dozens of comments. There's over 100 likes, and the comments significantly start to get a little further and further down the road. Well, why forget just White Pride Month? It should be white Christian or white Catholic or all of these things, white heterosexual Catholic, blah blah blah. And again, I think everybody's joking, but at some point in all months, at all times, this week, when we are celebrating the Declaration of Independence, we are celebrating the founding of this country, and to think about how far that strays from the actual intent of the founders, they're further tribalizing this country by doing that, by advocating for that, whether they're joking or not. There were people, I guarantee, in that group who didn't look at it as humorous. There were people in that who were liking that post, who were commenting on that post, who were saying, yeah, that's true. And all of a sudden you do start to worry. Is this movie that I thought was complete propaganda, that I thought was completely absurd, because I don't think that there's that many people who have racist intentions and racist feelings, is the idea that this can catch steam a reality, especially in a progressive world that we live in a progressive America that we live in. And it's quite terrifying. I'll make one final comment on it. And I think it takes us really well into our case study, which I'd like to talk a little bit about today.
Mm-hmm.
And that final comment is, you and I have another mutual friend who is actually here in Nashville, who's from Aurora, Colorado. He is a young black conservative country singer. He chimed in. He was friends with the same guy, and he says, I know a lot of you, and I'm going to tell you right now, these posts are disgusting. This comment section is absolutely disgusting, and this is not what we're about. And I agreed. I said to everybody, I said, this is not what America's about. I said, stop dividing us, stop making this more tribal.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up sharing the words from our case study of George Washington, which we've talked about in the past. There's two things that were written around our founding that I find to be two of the most beautiful things ever written in the world. One was the Declaration itself, and one was George Washington's letter in 1790 to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island.
Yeah.
That's what America's about. Those two documents, those two pieces of writing really embrace what America is all about. And I hope people listening will stand up and at some point say, you know what, we probably shouldn't be joking about things like that, because it's going to open. It makes us look bad. It makes us look un-American. It makes us look tribalistic. It makes us look progressive. And at the end of the day, it's not going to help us. It's not going to help our cause. So if you are joking, it's not a joke. It's not worth joking about. It's not helpful. And if you're not, you need help.
Yeah. If you're not, shame on you. You know, I'm going to make sort of a quick, deep philosophic point, and I think it'll be a nice transition to talk about our case study. One of the things that people tend to skip right over is the fact that every great moral code begins with, as a premise, with a recognition of what all human beings have in common, not just certain tribes. So, you know, arguably the greatest, or certainly the most famous, the most influential moral code over the last 2,000 years, 3,000 years has been the Bible. And you open to the Old Testament part, right? And there's a story of creation. And one of the things you can't help but notice is there's a hierarchy of beings, right? God is at the top. He creates all these different kinds of animals, and he creates one species whose job is to name all the animals. No animals name human beings, right? It's the job of the human beings to give names to all the other creatures. Yeah.
Wait, you mean Bear, who was just sitting behind you, didn't name you Tom?
He didn't name me.
He doesn't have his own name for you?
As much as I would love for Bear to chime in, because Bear is a wise old soul. I love Bear. But right there in the opening lines of the most influential book in the world, what you see is what humans have in common is, and how all humans are not God. They're not God, and all humans are not the beasts to be named and owned and used by humans. What all human beings have in common is really important. And then all the moral instructions, the moral codes that follow, apply to all human beings. Here's how you're supposed to live your life. When you turn to the philosophic tradition, Aristotle, in his book on the Politics, he makes a comment. He says, part of human nature, we are social creatures, and we're more than social creatures. We're political creatures. We live together, and we raise questions, and we debate, and sometimes we fight over things like what is justice, what is injustice, right? What's right and what's wrong. And Aristotle says any being who doesn't need to live with other humans is either a god or a beast. His point is, all human beings have something in common. They share a kind of nature, and then proceeds to talk about what is good for human beings, right? Not what is good for this group, right, or that group, or right. This is the right way of life. This is what's good for all human beings. And that's so basic. That is so foundational, that premise that what matters the most in matters of morals and politics, what matters the most is what we human beings have in common. We forget this because we so quickly want to start talking about groups of people, either the group that we're in, this is my favorite group and I like this group, or other groups, right? I don't like them because they're the other group. And we skip right over that basic kind of philosophic premise. And that, that sort of brings us to the case study. This might be one of, if not my favorite case study that we've done yet. It is certainly connected to the Declaration of Independence and the ideas contained in it, but it really steps back and takes a look at how the Declaration and the people involved, the people writing it and the people who acted upon it after it was adopted, really changed the world, changed not only how Americans looked at things, but really how the world looks at things in a good way. And I wanted to go back just a little bit and give kind of a perspective on why this is important. One of the greatest concerns for any government, and this is true throughout all of time, wherever you find a political regime, the regime or the people who are part of the regime, the ruling governing class, whomever that is, they want to be viewed as legitimate. They want their government to be viewed as the legitimate government. The worst thing in the world that can happen to those in government is for large numbers of people to start viewing that government as illegitimate. If large numbers start to see their government as illegitimate, that government's not going to be around much longer. So something bad is going to happen, or they're going to have to rule by just cracking down with harsh, terrible violence and that sort of thing. And it's one of the reasons why. So in older regimes, if you go back through history, very often they claimed to be authorized from God. I mean, we saw this for 15 centuries in the medieval period, the whole divine right theory of kings, right? When someone would claim to be king, I'm going to be the king, I'm in charge, I'm going to govern you. And if someone asked the basic question, well, why you? Why are you the king? Why are you in this position? The answer was, well, God appointed me. God put me here, right? I was appointed by God to rule over you. Therefore, you don't have any authority to question or challenge my legitimacy. That's what makes me legitimate as king. That's important. Number one, in the founding, our founding fathers rejected all that. They said the legitimacy of this regime is not going to be some claim that a king or God appointed a king. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to base ours on the consent of the governed. But more importantly, have you ever thought about why is it that progressives spend so much time beating up on the founding, bashing the founding? They launch entire enterprises, organizations, books, websites devoted to trying to undermine the founding. And the reason is they want to delegitimize the founding. They want to delegitimize the founders, and then especially the founders' constitution and everything that the founders built and created. In the last century and a half, there have been effectively, basically, two main lines of critiques of the founding. The first, this was the early progressive critique, going all the way back to the beginning of progressivism 150 years ago. The first line of critique is that the founding is defective because it's old, it's outdated. The ideas of the founding have been, nobody believes them anymore. Science has disproven them. And the founders' constitution is just outdated. It's sort of irrelevant. It can't provide for a government for a modern society. That's the first line of attack on the founding. It's old, it's outdated. The second line of attack really doesn't come until the 1960s, and it's sort of part of the civil rights movement, and it's a deeply moral critique of the founding, that the founding was fundamentally immoral. These people were racist, they were unjust, they were terrible human beings. Therefore, why should we be bound by their constitution and the principles they espouse? That's why we have things like the 1619 Project, and that's why
Right.
most university social science entire departments of history and political science and sociology and all these things, their main purpose isn't to advance science. Their main purpose is to undermine the legitimacy of the American regime, of the constitutional republic, because that helps progressives get what they want, replacing a constitutional republic with a modern progressive administrative state. And so one of our interests,
real
yeah,
quick before you
yeah,
before you move on from that, I think it was a really important part of the case study that I don't want people to overlook, and so I wanted to point to it. The first part of what you were just talking about, this
yeah,
delegitimization because it's old. I think
hmm
we've seen a revival of that conversation in recent years, right? Especially around things like guns. The founders couldn't have known
yeah,
that there would have been AK-47s, so you can't apply the Second Amendment. And I just loved what Calvin Coolidge said. And it's so interesting to me that he was seeing the same arguments
hmm
110 years ago ish. Am I right on my
he,
dates there? But a little
yeah. I
over
mean,
100 years ago.
he's
It,
president in the mid 1920s. He's there. He's seen with his own eyes the very first emergence of progressivism. He know Calvin Coolidge was a very smart man. He was very insightful.
yeah.
He knew what was happening in the universities. He saw this trend going, and what we quote from him in the case study, in a way, that's his response. That is his response to progressivism. That if these ideas are true, if it's true that you and I are equally human, and if it's a self-evident truth that you and I have the same unalienable rights, each of us has a natural right to our life, our liberty, free pursuit of happiness, then his point is you can't make progress beyond that. Right? Once you agree
Yeah.
to that, that is perfect justice. Those ideas are perfect. You can't move beyond. The only way to move is backward, is to start denying rights to some people, or denying that some groups should give their consent, things like this.
More importantly, denying truth, right? If we think about, right, our whole concept of our podcast is Plato's cave. It's this idea of
Mhm.
leading people out of the cave and engaging in conversation to discover what is true. I would argue for the rest of my life that the founders finally brought together all the decades, centuries of thought to write down on paper, this is what's true. This is what society should be based on. This is what's true. And therefore, to challenge that is to deny truth. It is regressive. To
Mhm.
to to deny truth is not a progressive. You can't progress beyond truth. It's fact. It's clear. You can't do anything different. So I think there is that interesting sort of work at play in that scenario.
Well, and to be clear, just so our members know, I mean, I think this helps prepare our members when they're out in public or political situations. Progressives basically have both of those cards in their pocket. That critique of being old and outdated, and the moral critique that the founders were immoral and racist and bigoted. And they'll play whichever card is useful at the time. So, in some cases, it makes sense to say, well, we have the internet and we have all this technology that didn't exist. And the Constitution is just outdated. It's not sufficient for a modern society. Or if it's more convenient, they'll say, well, who cares if a bill is unconstitutional or some program or policy is unconstitutional? The founders were racist, and the Constitution that they produced was a racist document, so we shouldn't care. And those two lines of attack, back and forth, they've in a way they've been devastating. Those of us who care about the Constitution, those of us who think the Constitution is a pretty wise, right? It's not perfect. It's an instrument. It was designed by human minds and written by human hands. It's pretty good compared to all the other constitutions that have been around. It's pretty good, and what it represents, this idea of constitutionally limiting the power of government, hey, that's a pretty good idea. That's a wise thing. Those of us who care about that, we haven't done a very good job of defending the Constitution when the Constitution is under all these kinds of attacks and critiques. And so this is, in a way, this is a big part of what the Vino and Veritas Society is all about. It's why we're the guardians, right? We're trying to guard these ideas of the founding, guard the Constitution, guard the purpose of the Constitution. Oh, here's my friend Mr. Bear's back.
I saw
that. He's going to get comfortable here and lay down, I'm guessing. And so here's what we do in this case study. I wanted to give everyone sort of a big overview as you approach this case study. Progressives today are so quick to denounce the foundings for, say they were racist, they were bigots, they were misogynists, they didn't care about black people, they didn't care about women. And the premise there, now they never say this premise. This is an unspoken premise of progressives. They speak as if the world had solved basically all problems. There were no injustices. There were no monarchies. There was no misogyny. There was no slavery. There was no theft happening, except for America. These reactionary Americans kept engaging in all these injustices while the rest of the world was pure, was morally pure and wholesome. And so shame on those founders. That's the premise of the progressive critique of the founding. And yet the truth is exactly the opposite, literally 180 degrees opposite. What you find in the rest of the world in 1776, in the rest of the world was dominated by monarchies. People lived under kings for whom they did not elect. Slavery was a global industry. Everybody was in on it. Buying slaves, selling slaves, including Africans, were begging Westerners to keep the Atlantic slave trade open because it was a great business for them. Property rights were basically unknown in most of the world. Little parts of the Western world had some protection for property. In many places, the government really was the only real property owner. And so our case study points out, look at what the world was in 1776. And along come these Americans. And in every one of these big injustices, they're the first as a people. I mean, as a national people, right? Not just one mind writing a book, but as a nation of people to stand up and say, hey, monarchy's wrong. That's wrong. We should not be living under a king we don't elect. And they talk about it openly. And if you knew nothing else, Dave, if you knew nothing else about American history except this group of revolutionaries stood up and they said, we know monarchy's really old. We know people have been living under kings for thousands of years, and we think that's illegitimate. That is an illegitimate form of government.
Yeah.
We think people should consent to their own republic. If they just did that, you would say, well, good job, right? Like, congratulations. That's a good thing. And they did not only that, they did the same thing with property rights. They stood up and said, we as a people, we're forming a new nation, and we think property rights are really important. If whatever's yours, Dave, whatever you produce, right, whatever rightfully belongs to you, you should be protected in that. The laws should protect you. The law should punish anyone who comes and steals from you what is really rightfully yours. That didn't exist anywhere in the world. In fact, many tribes right here in the United States, in North America, many native tribes denied the very concept of property. They said there is no such thing. The earth belongs to everybody. The Americans did this with religious liberty. I mean, this is one of the most monumental shifts. To use a modern progressive term, awareness or consciousness raising, there was no awareness. There was no consciousness that religious persecution was wrong, was fundamentally unjust. There was no large public political movement to get rid of established churches, right? And the terrible persecution that went along with it. Think of medieval um, Christian kings like Charlemagne, who, he did some very good things, but he also went around, would literally have people's heads cut off if they didn't belong to the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church is what legitimized his government. So you had to be part of his church, and he would punish you, he'd torture you, he'd kill you.
Except for if you were Jewish and he didn't want to give his money to the Roman Catholic Church, so he'd enslave you and make you hold his money. I mean, for those who don't know, and I would love to have this conversation with anybody who's interested, that is the entire backstory of this age-old stereotype about Jews and banking.
Yeah.
Jews and banking started under Charlemagne because he said it was usury. I want to loan money. I want to be the lender. And the Catholic Church is telling me, give me all your money. And everybody was so afraid of the Catholic Church and of going to hell that they would do whatever the church said. And he says, wait, I got this group of people over here, these Jews over here, who aren't afraid of the Catholic Church, who aren't worried about the threats about afterlife. I'm gonna enslave them, and I'm gonna make them hold my money and make them be my bankers, and that way I can keep all my money. I did want to comment on one other thing, because there's a great irony to everything you just said, and that great irony is the party today that is so against organized religion, the party today that is saying we need these leaders that know the way and can make decisions, and bureaucrats who can help tell us how to live our lives. But that doesn't come from the church. That comes from what they call they really look at it as mob rule and a lot of those things. This is the same party that says that everything before 1776 was fine, that all of these things that were going on, they've ignored it, like you were saying. And all of those things were happening because of monarchs who were put there by God, right?
Yes.
You have these people today who have completely rejected.
They claim to be put there by God.
Right. So you have this whole movement today of people, and I'm not going to say party, it's a movement, because it extends beyond just the Democrat Party. It's the progressive movement, or all of these people who are sitting there pushing back on religion and pushing back on church and saying that all of the things that the church is doing is wrong. And yet they will defend everything pre-1776, saying the world had figured it out and these Americans came in and started slavery. They're so confused on the facts.
Yep.
They're so confused on the truth of that. And there's so much irony to that for me.
Yeah, well, and let me I'm going to tweak that just a little bit for clarity's sake. It's not that progressives openly say everything was perfect. This really is an unspoken premise. They speak as if everything was fine, as if everything was good. They just sort of ignore that, right? And then they look at the Americans and say, shame, shame. These Americans had slaves. These Americans, there were women who didn't vote, among these, as if the world was really good. And the truth, it is the opposite. I mean, I'm going to generalize here, but I can certainly back this up. Prior to 1776, the world was kind of a crummy place. It was an ugly place. Ugly, terrible things are happening in Africa. I mean, if you were a black-skinned African on the West Coast and you weren't very strong and you weren't very fast, it was a bad place to live, because chances were high you were going to be kidnapped and forcibly sold into slavery. It was an ugly place to be. To live in Europe, to live in England, to live in France, these were ugly, terrible places to live. Why did these settlers come to North America in the early 1600s? What were they fleeing from? When they got on those boats, we think of sailing today, or getting out, you go get on a cruise ship or something, you think nothing of it. But to get on a creaky wooden boat in 1630 and head across the North Atlantic, I mean, you were taking your own life into your hands. It was a real question. Would you actually reach your destination alive, or not? Would you drown in the process? And you think, my goodness, that's so harrowing. That's so risky. What were those people running away from? And the answer is they were running away from terrible religious persecution. They were running away from their property rights continuously being violated. They couldn't keep, right? Life was bad. Injustices were rampant around the world. So when you see the world as this dark, ugly, violent place filled with injustice, and then you look at the Americans, it's a whole different view. Wow, here are these groups saying, we think government by consent is the right thing. Let's try that. And maybe they're not perfect, maybe they don't get it exactly right the first time. They say, we think monarchy's wrong. Let's ditch that. Let's put a provision in our Constitution, which they did. In Article 6 of our Constitution, it says no titles of nobility. The law will not recognize you as a duke or a baron, right, or a prince, or no titles of nobility mean nothing under the United States Constitution. They said we're going to try to protect property rights. We're going to try to establish laws that protect people in their property so that if they create something, produce something, purchase something, they're secure in these things. They said churches here aren't going to have any political power. If you're a church, you don't get to make the laws, and you don't get your own police force and your own army, right? And forcibly go make people follow your rules. And they said, we think slavery's wrong. We think slavery's wrong because all men are created equal. Let's start working and figure out how to get rid of it. And they did that in very short order. That's what our case study is all about. And when you look at the good things the Americans did and those beautiful ideas and principles they put forth for the whole world to see, right? They said, here, everything was public. They published their Declaration of Independence and all these other writings, and they said to the world, if you think monarchy is good, or you think slavery is good, or you think government stealing private property is good, here's our argument. Here are our principles, what we think is just. Come criticize them. Come refute these arguments if you can. I mean, when I really step back and think about what the world was like and all the good that the Americans brought into the world, it is one of the greatest moral awakenings, political awakenings. It's like they turned the light on, right, for the world to see what's true and what's good and what's just, and here's a model, and we're working on it. We're just human beings. Our Articles of Confederation might not be perfect, our Constitution might not be perfect, but we're getting the ball rolling. We're headed toward justice. To me, I look at that and think, how could you offer anything but congratulations, but praise and thanks? Say thank you for doing that. Instead, progressives wag their finger and say, shame on them. They didn't instantly solve every problem in the world. It's crazy.
Yeah. And at the same time, they refuse to look at the other side. I mean, imagine what happens if you did any of those things. If you went and questioned the monarch, if you went and questioned Pharaoh, if you went and questioned Charlemagne, I mean, you lose your head. There's no, you can't challenge those governments. And this was a group of people who would have welcomed even the challenges of the 1619 Project, from the 1619 Project. If they were around at that time, the founders would have welcomed the challenge. They would have expected them to engage in real conversation and not just shout them down, not just try to beat them up, not just try to engage in a mob, but they would have welcomed the conversation. They would have welcomed any conversation to learn this better.
Dave, can you imagine? I want our listeners here to imagine this, and maybe someone with some video production skills could actually turn this into a little mini movie. Imagine a conversation where you have Tom Jefferson and John Adams and Ben Franklin, right, and the authors of the Declaration, the editors, in a room, and then they're talking about what should be in here. And imagine Hannah Nicole Jones was there with them. She's right there in the room. She's the one who the main writer for the 1619 Project. And suppose Tom Jefferson turns to her and says, "Hey, Hannah, we are thinking about saying all men are created equal and all human beings have the same unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and therefore slavery's wrong. Should we say that, or should we say we hold these truths to be self-evident that all black people are inferior to white people? Because we could say that. What do you think, Hannah? Which would you prefer that we do? And how would she answer that? Because we know what the founders did. They said equality of natural rights. Everybody, that's what they did. And little progressive pinheads like her want to come along and say, that was bad. That was wrong. Well, okay. Should they have asserted white nationalism in their Declaration of Independence? Should they have said white people or white Christians, going back to the Facebook comments that we were just talking about, should they have asserted that kind of tribal politics in their Declaration of Independence? Or should they have written a perfectly true statement of universal moral principle the way they did?
Well, we know that not only did they do it the way they did it that way because they meant it. They believed truly in the ideas that they put on those papers. So I'm going to encourage everybody. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of passion in this topic, and there was a lot of passion in this conversation. I know it's not the best word to be using. It's a little bit of a progressive term, but there's a lot of energy behind it. I hope everybody in their chapter meetings has the same.
Bear's not very passionate about this.
No. I hope everybody enjoys it and has a really nice conversation in their chapter meetings this month. You and I are going to start working on sharing some new things coming from the Vino Veritas Society, and among those are more events like we have coming up on July 28th in Nashville, where we're going to really get into this idea, and you're going to get up on stage with Dr. Ben Carson and really dig into this case study. I mean, this case study is sort of a foundation of a lot of what you're going to be speaking about on July 28th. And we're working on all kinds of different things. There will likely be, I'm not promising yet, but there will likely be a live stream of it for those who can't join us in Nashville, but we'd love to see you there. If you'd like to come out, we already have people buying their tickets. We've been hearing people are booking their hotels, booking their airfare.
Hey, Dave. I've had several people asking me, what is the quickest, fastest way? How do they get information about the event and tickets? Where do people go?
VinoandVeritasSociety.com/events.
Okay.
Plural, EVENTS. So VinoandVeritasSociety.com/events. And then, as we talked about last week, if anybody's interested, we are doing table sponsorships. We're also doing, we have other sponsorships available. If anybody's interested in getting more involved in that, send me an email at info at VinoandVeritasSociety.com. And we will continue to proceed with this. And these are the types of things that are going to have to be the big conversations. And included in that, I hope everybody starts to really think twice about, what am I saying and how am I saying it? And if something's a joke, is it appropriate, or should I be thinking a little bit otherwise? And who might I be influencing? We talk all the time about, if you and Hannah Nicole Jones are sitting across the table from each other debating, you might never change her mind, right? She is so dug in, but you never know who else is listening, who you can influence. The same goes for some of these jokes. If you're making a joke, you never know who is listening, and we start to see some of the other things that are happening, and some people might not believe it's a joke, and there are things that are funny, and there are things that are just inappropriate, and I'm gonna call anybody out who says, oh, let's have a White Pride Month as a joke. It's inappropriate. It's not helpful. It's not helping us accomplish anything, and it's antithetical to the Declaration. And this of all weeks is the worst time you should be doing that. Not that there's a better time in that at all. So I hope everybody will enjoy their chapter meetings. I'd love to hear how they go. I hope everybody had a wonderful 4th of July Independence Day holiday. And I hope we see some of you on July 28th in Franklin, Tennessee.
Till then, no sumos custodes.
Yeah.